So we welcome anybody who is listening or watching on YouTube. Not that there's an image here, but that doesn't matter. This is the website scienceetreligion.com, and we are very pleased today to have the privilege of talking with the Reverend Howard Storm in conjunction with the whole subject of near-death experience, which is one that we've featured quite heavily on our website. One in which a lot of research is currently happening, in which there's huge public interest. And the Reverend Howard Storm is the author of a number of books, but the best known being My Descent into Death, A Second Chance at Life, which relates his near-death experience in Paris at the Hôpital Cochin back in 1985. So, Howard Storm, thank you very much for agreeing to this interview. And let's not start exactly at the beginning, but I'd like to hear a little bit about what you were doing before you came to Paris. What brought you to Paris?
I was a professor of art. I taught painting and drawing primarily at Northern Kentucky University, and I was a practicing artist. I was exhibiting my work, and I'd been to Europe one time before and wanted to take a group of students around. So we had spent 3 weeks. Started in the Netherlands, went up to from the Netherlands up into Denmark and a little bit into Sweden, and then down to Germany, and then a week in France, which of course isn't hardly enough, but got to go to the Louvre numerous times and things like that. And we were on the very last day of our trip when I had my experience. So I was a very arrogant, prideful artist. Our heroes were personalities like Picasso, which means very egotistical and proud, very strong-willed. I was an atheist, and I didn't believe in anything except myself and my goals in my pursuit of life, which was to have as much pleasure as possible and as little pain as possible, and to become a successful artist. And
Right.
that's what I was at.
Okay. So that's where you're at. But reading your your accounts of your experience, it seems that when you were younger, it wasn't always like that. That you did have a religious background, if I'm correct.
Yes, I was raised in the Congregational Church in Massachusetts, and um, the I was very, very interested in Christianity as a young man. Matter of fact, my pastor suggested to me that he thought I had the call to be a minister, and after questioning him about what he really believed, I came to the conclusion that the whole thing was hypocrisy, that it was all that didn't really believe in anything except that we should be good people, we should be nice to each other. That was all he believed in. And
What age were you when you took the decision to sort of quit the church?
15, I was 15 years old. I decided that the whole thing was a big giant hoax. I was having um, a lot of struggle with my father, and he was a salesperson, very successful salesman, and he was a huge hypocrite. My father was. I mean, spoke with utter contempt about his customers, but when he was with them, they were his fawning and his best friends in the whole world, and how much he cared about them and their families. But in private, he spoke about them in the most horrible terms. Anyway, so I attribute that the my father's work, the work of the church, it was all lies, it was all hypocrisy, and that I just wanted to deal with reality, which was basically what you can see, what you can touch, what you can measure. That's true. Everything else is false. And that was one of the things that I liked about art, was that when you start moving the paint around, that's pretty real. It's very tangible. It's very immediate. and you can evaluate its effect or lack of effect immediately. So I love the immediacy and the reality of art.
So so although you were an artist, you had a kind of scientific materialist worldview.
Very much so, very, very much so.
But from what I've read, you were kind of precocious in the amount of philosophy that you'd read as well as a teenager.
Yeah, of course, we didn't have any philosophy in the school curriculum, but I was trying to figure out what life was about. So at a very early age, I started off with, my education was self-directed, so I started off with Plato and Aristotle, and then moved my way up a little bit through the Middle Ages and got to Kant, and then eventually into existentialism. And I landed in existentialism. And when I went to college at the age of 17, for my what I thought then was my good fortune, my teacher was an atheist existentialist teacher, and we used to go out in the evening with a few of the select students, of which I consider myself fortunate to be one of them, and drink in bars, drink beer, and smoke cigarettes, and talk about existentialism. And the wonderful thing about it is it's a tremendously cynical, skeptical place to be, where you can look down on society and say that they're all delusional and foolish, and that we are the only ones that have insight into the real truth.
So, and that was the climate, presumably. And you, if I'm not mistaken, you were born in 46, yes?
Yes.
So that would have been the early 60s.
Yes.
And that was also the time that, and you make this point in your book, that there was a bit of a crisis in, certainly in America, and it's true in Britain as well, of theology at that time. It's that I think you mentioned that in Time magazine they had this cover which was it was the God is dead kind of movement.
Right.
People like Altizer.
Solid black cover with white letters. God is dead, and it talked about that the prevailing theology in the major universities was that there is no God, that the whole thing was bankrupt. And my pastor, who I'd been very, very close to, who suggested that I had a call to go into ministry, was one of those people.
Well, in a way, that's kind of amazing. But it does tally with what I've heard from a lot of people on this side of the Atlantic as well, also in a Catholic context, that the prevailing mood at the time was against anything remotely supernatural. Supernatural simply didn't exist. And unfortunately, because so much of Christian theology and biblical study is based on the idea that the supernatural is real, then you've got a huge identity crisis that happened in the 60s and 70s.
I think you're understating the problem. The supernatural was not only considered to be unreal, untrue, but psychologists considered it to be psychotic. And I mean that in the most pejorative sense, that if you'd gone to a psychiatrist at that time, most psychiatrists would have said you were suffering from delusions and needed to be healed from any delusions that anything supernatural was real.
Right.
You couldn't go to a psychiatrist and talk about angels. You would have been institutionalized.
And you think that there's a sort of intellectual intimidation came about because of that?
Oh, absolutely.
And that you participated in it as a professor as well?
Yeah, because I felt it was my duty. I mean, I'm ashamed of this now, but I felt it was my duty when students would talk about their church or their faith or about Jesus or the Bible and stuff. But I thought it was my duty to tell them that stuff is nonsense. You got to grow up, get a life, get mature. Have reason. Have a scientific point of view, and grow out of that kind of thing.
Right. Okay. So, from what I remember in your account, the really curious thing is that obviously the first research into near-death experience carried out by people like Raymond Moody starts to come out in the mid-70s, and that you and your colleagues at the university come across his book Life After Life, and you discussed it as well.
Right, and we thought it was really interesting. We thought it was an interesting way to understand the dying process, that you have some kind of induced by a release of endorphins because of the trauma of dying, because dying is, accompanied with a great deal of physical and emotional suffering, that you would have this wonderful euphoric hallucination before you died. And so that was a way to, yeah, you can see it with animals when they die. You can see them sort of go like into a sort of weird state of euphoria as they are dying. I'd experienced that with my pets.
So that was your belief about death when you actually had your experience in 1985?
Yeah, because we knew we thought every rational being knew that we were an electrochemical organism, and that when that ceases to function, it's the end of it, and there is no consciousness or soul or spirit after that. It's just, it's over. Life is short, and then it ends.
So in fact that the brain and consciousness were absolutely the same thing. No brain, no consciousness.
Right.
So, okay, so we get...
A lot of people do that today.
Right, so let's get... This is June, am I right? June 1985?
Right.
What happens to you?
Well, without going into all the boring detail, at 11 o'clock in the morning at the Hotel de Lima on the Rue Saint-Germain in Paris, I had a perforation of the duodenum, which is the small stomach. It took me to the floor, thrashing, screaming, swearing, yelling. The most acute pain I'd ever experienced in my life, because what was happening was the gastric acids and enzymes and things were now leaking into my abdominal cavity. I was in total terror and panic, and my wife called desk at the hotel. He called the receptionist there, called emergency service. The doctor came, got me off the floor, examined me, knew exactly what was wrong, told me that I had to have surgery immediately or I would die. And he called an ambulance. They came and carried me out of the hotel, put me in an ambulance, and took me to the big city hospital, the Hospital General d'Assistance Publique de Paris, and went into the emergency room at Cochin, and was examined by 2 more doctors. They were very nice, took my medical history, told me that I had to have surgery immediately or I would die. And that's been confirmed by every American doctor I've ever talked to about this, since that's critical. And I was taken by gurney away to the surgical part of that large institution, and I was put in a room, and unbeknownst to me and my family, there was no doctor available to do the surgery. So I was never assigned to a doctor. Therefore, nobody could give me any medications. So I never received at Cochin anything, as in that means nothing. And the pain, which was incredibly horrible, which the doctor who came to the hotel administered, what he told me was a very small amount of morphine, just enough to get me out of the hotel and into the ambulance. He said because he couldn't give me enough to alleviate the pain because it would interfere with the surgery.
Oh, okay. So,
other than that, I was never given anything. And over the hours where I was never seen by a doctor at the surgical hospital, I begged and pleaded for something, because the pain got worse and worse and worse, because what was happening was that the gastric acids and enzymes were migrating throughout my abdominal cavity, and I was literally being digested by my own digestive
not
juices.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah, and it felt like fire. It felt like I had a fire in me, and it was getting bigger and hotter inside of me. Um, this started at 11 o'clock in the morning. I was at the hospital by 11:30. 5 in the afternoon, I knew I was dying. Nothing had happened. 8:30 that night, a nurse came into the room and she said that they were unable to locate a doctor and they could try and get one the next day, Sunday. When she said that, I had been struggling since sometime in the afternoon to stay alive. It was very, very difficult to breathe. And I was determined to stay alive because I knew that if I died, I was 38 years old, and I was achieving my life goals. I had a wife, I had 2 kids, I was a full tenured professor at a university. I was exhibiting my work and winning awards, and I was 38 years old. I didn't want to die, and I really wanted to live, and so I fought as hard as I could to keep breathing and stay alive. But when she said there was no doctor available, I knew that it was absolutely hopeless, and there's no point in struggling anymore. So I said my goodbyes to my wife, and closed my eyes and I stopped trying to breathe, and I went unconscious.
And at that point, something that you didn't expect happened.
Quite unexpected. I awoke from my unconsciousness to find myself standing next to the bed, feeling better than I'd ever felt in my entire life, more alive. And I was so amazed by this that my first reaction was to do a reality check, which is I started to touch myself. I started at the top of my head and felt my face, and then my shoulders, and then my arms, and my abdomen, and then down my body all the way to the bottom of my feet. And it's like, wow, I'm completely whole and intact and alive. And then I started looking around the room, and I realized that my vision was enhanced. I realized my sense of smell was enhanced, my sense of touch, hearing. I was like hearing the buzz of the fluorescent lights and feeling the texture of the linoleum floor through the soles of my feet, and smelling my roommate who had a very strong odor because he hadn't been bathed in a long time. And it was just exhilarating to feel so alive, like I'd never felt before, until I realized that there was a occupant in the bed that I had been in. And when I examined the face of the occupant in the bed, which was turned away from me, I had to bend over to look at the face. To my horror, it looked like an exact replica of me. And I knew that it could not be me because I was standing there looking at it, and you can't be 2 places at once. Any rational person knows you can't bifurcate. It's not possible. So I was trying to figure out why there would be a replica of me in the bed, and coming up with all kinds of strange theories that didn't make any sense. And so I started to try and communicate with my wife, and she had no response to me, which eventually made me very angry with her, because in our relationship, whenever she was mad at me, she would not respond to me. She would laugh at me. And so I figured she was really angry at me. So she wouldn't communicate with me, so I tried to communicate with my roommate, who was Monsieur Florent, who was a very kind 68-year-old retired French administrator, and very nice man. And he didn't respond to me either, which disturbed me, because he had no reason to be angry at me. I mean, I hadn't done anything to him except to occupy the bed next to him. And I heard people calling me from outside the room.
If I can just stop you at this point, what's so interesting, if you know a little bit about this field also, is that you're not the first person to have had this kind of experience, and that you had presumably, if you'd read Raymond Moody's Life After Life, you must have read some of these reports, but you didn't put these 2 things together at all.
No, because what was happening to me was all so out of any experience I'd ever had, and so confusing and exhilarating and overwhelming that I wasn't, thinking back to anything. I was thinking about where am I, what's going on,
Sure.
what's happening to me,
Mm-hmm. But presumably you didn't have a roadmap of any kind for what was
No.
happening to you. Okay, so then you heard that some people were calling to you.
Yes, and one of the things that I thought was they were speaking to me in English, and I thought that's strange because everybody in the hospital speaks French. It's like, who are these English-speaking people that are calling me to come to them? So I went over to the doorway of the room, and they were back in the shadowy hallway, and I said, I'm sick, I need a doctor, I need to have surgery, I'm waiting for the doctor, and they said, we know all about you, we've been waiting for you, it's time for you to go, hurry, come with us. So I assumed that they were hospital staff to walk me to my surgery.
Mm-hmm.
And so, with great hesitation, because I had a really bad feeling about them.
Oh, right at the start, you already had a bad feeling that this was something strange.
Because I was a real man, and had been trained in high school playing football and stuff to ignore your feelings because their feelings are irrational, and you don't ever pay attention to your feelings. I left the room and went out and was encircled by this group of people, and they took me down the hallway, which turned out to be without any definition whatsoever. The hallway just went on and on. It was there was no architecture, and it was dark, so it was hard to perceive anything. But it was just a space with a ground that we walked on, and we walked and walked and walked. And if I were to reconstruct the walk, I would have to walk many, many miles to replicate that walk. But I was also becoming having this very uneasy feeling that my sense of time was not working. I always had, because I was a teacher, I had an acute sense of time.
Yeah, sure.
And in this experience, it's like, this is all too strange. It's too weird. There's no sense. And I would say to the people, where are we going? When are we going to get there? This hospital isn't this big. It's too far. And they would say, shut up. You'll find out. You'll know when you get there. And as I journeyed with them, they went from rude to threatening and hostile. And I became very, very afraid of what was going to happen to me. And I finally got to the point, we're in complete darkness now. I said to them, I'm not going with you any further. And they said, no, you're going further with us. And I said, no, I'm not. And I stopped. And that's when they began to push and pull at me, and I fought back with them.
Yeah, and after that it can speak gruesome, and I think we can probably spare the listeners the details of that. I mean, they can, if people are really interested, there's lots of places on the internet they can find out about it.
And I've often told people I've never ever told anyone what really happened there, and I never will tell anyone that happened there because it's way too disturbing. It's way too disturbing, and it's way too disgusting to relate.
Mm-hmm. Do you ever, and presumably, I mean, having sort of thought so many years about this experience, do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd not gone with them right at the beginning?
I think I would have been stuck in that hospital.
Aha.
I would have what we would commonly call a ghost or a spirit. I think I would have been stuck there.
No, that's a very interesting remark, because obviously, I mean, this is going in a direction that I'm sure that some of our listeners have already turned off, because we're talking about things which obviously science has no explanation for, but which are attested to, I think in many of, I think perhaps all the world's traditions. In fact, the idea of of a certain presence in a place of somebody who is no longer in their physical body.
Right.
Uh, and of course, there are huge debates about what that might be. Uh, but it's interesting to hear your particular perspective that that's what you feel might have happened to you. You know, listeners can obviously judge how they want about that. But okay, so you've basically been assaulted by how many? Perhaps 100 of
Well,
these beings or
initially,
whatever.
initially the group was small, maybe less than a dozen, but as time went on, it grew and grew. And because I couldn't see because of the darkness, I don't know how many, but I think there were hundreds or more. It was a mob. I was in a mob.
And you were convinced that these were human beings.
Yes. Well, formerly people who had lived on this earth who had um, chosen to go to this place.
Hmm. So you have a kind of basically combat with them, but of course it's hopeless from your point of view. Uh, Except that then there's a bit of a turnaround in the story, to put it mildly.
Well, eventually they had shredded me to the point where I was just a mass of gore laying on the floor of that place, and people were kicking me, and I wasn't responding except with moans and groans anymore. And I heard a voice which may have emanated from me. I don't know where it came from, but anyways, it said, "Pray to God." And I thought, what a stupid idea. I don't believe in God. And the voice said, "Pray to God." And I thought, I don't pray. I don't know how to pray. I can't even remember how to pray. And the voice said, "Pray to God." And I thought, I can't. And the voice said, third time, "Pray to God." And I thought, when I was a child, I'd gone to church and we'd learned prayers. What were those? And I was trying to remember prayers, and at first all I could remember was things that I had memorized when I was a child, like the Pledge of Allegiance and Shylock's speech in The Merchant of Venice and Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. And I'm remembering all this stuff, and I keep thinking, those aren't prayers, those are just things I remember, from my childhood. And then I remembered, the Lord is my shepherd. That's all I remembered. So, in trying to be clear about it, I murmured it. And when I did that, the people that were around me became extremely angry and were saying to me in very, very vile, obscene ways, "There is no God. Nobody can hear you. Your prayers are worthless. And if you don't stop that, we're going to do much worse things to you than what we've already done." Along with them making these threats, they were retreating away from me because the prayers were so threatening to them, so hard for them to be in the presence of, that they were backing away. So for the first time in my encounter with these people, I had a way of getting back at them. So I started saying stuff about God, anything that came to mind. I started shouting it, and their reaction was to retreat. And eventually I found myself shouting, and there was no sense, because keep in mind, I'm in complete darkness, there was no sense of them being anywhere close anymore. And I think they'd gone beyond earshot. And so I laid there and I thought about what had happened to me. And since I, at that time, had no theological or religious understanding whatsoever, what I concluded is that after going over my life, I went over my whole life, and I came to the conclusion that my life was meaningless and worthless and purposeless, and that I had been a smug, manipulative, self-satisfied person who had accomplished nothing. I came to the conclusion that I had been garbage all of my life, and that garbage goes down the sewer pipe into the cesspool, and now I was in the cesspool with all the other garbage.
Okay, well, this sounds pretty terrible. But listening to this, I'm just going to try and sort of play amateur psychiatrist here. Presumably somebody's going to say, well, let's try and explain his experience like this, that at this moment when he's clearly close to death, he has some kind of regressional dream in which his religious childhood comes out and there's feelings of guilt, and he's trying to reconcile this. Presumably, I mean, you must have thought of this possibility, I suppose, when you came back to health. But how did it compare to any kind of dream experience you'd had? Or I don't know. You know.
Okay, there's two questions I want to address. First one is, if I'd had a dream, I would have liked to have dreamt to have fallen into a Turkish harem where I was the Sultan and these hundreds of nubile, beautiful young ladies were anxious to please me in every way. That would have been my dream.
Mm-hmm.
No, what kind of person would have a dream of this hellish experience? I wasn't that kind of person. I wanted pleasure. I wanted joy. I wanted lust.
So in other words, your subconscious was not working in this particular kind of way.
Well, I mean, you think about it. Really, really sick mind to imagine that you've gone into hell. And I wasn't a masochist.
Hmm.
I was a hedonist.
You were a hedonist, but your body is your body is still on this gurney, and this is what's lots of people tell stories about all sorts of things, but I think what is compelling to anyone who's read this account is the fact that there is a medical basis to it, and the plain fact is that you have this moment in which you are confronted with your own body. Your consciousness is from outside looking at your body, and which seems to tally with so many experiences that we've read about in the literature. And that's, I think, what gives, what makes me continue to listen to this horrible story. Because it's clear that if we're trying to look at a model for what sort of state you could have been in, because I think this is very strange.
What I experienced at the beginning of this experience was an ecstatic state of being. I mean, I tell you, I felt better than I ever felt before in my life, and that this, over a very long duration of time, degenerated into this hellish thing.
Yeah, and that's disturbing because I think that is, sorry for interrupting, but I think that is disturbing because having looked at the sort of general consensus, if you can talk about it that way, among people who read about near-death experiences, or some people have had them, the prevailing tone is about this sort of sense of elation at being released from the body, of having a new form of perception, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if the kind of experience that, because obviously what you're relating is incredibly detailed, and most if you go on the internet, you read hear about them talking about their near-death experiences. Most of them are quite short, and they dwell very much on this initial sense of release. And I think what you're suggesting is that may not be the whole story, and perhaps it is for some. I don't know. But
and we're just at the beginning of my story. I mean, I can go on for hours and hours and hours telling you what happened next.
Okay, well, we're gonna have to summarize this, I think. But
right.
Okay, but it gets better. I mean, let's without trying to spoil this too much. It does get better. So anyway, you're in this cesspool, basically.
Yeah. So,
whatever that is.
Anyways, I came to the conclusion that I was stuck there, and there was no way out, and this was my fate, and that the only thing that I could do would be to somehow gather up my resources as this gore and become, instead of being the victim of their torment, that I would become a tormentor.
All right.
I would be only, I didn't want to be a victim anymore. I wanted to be, somehow successful in this place.
So you're saying that you felt that option was sort of available to you.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And then part of me said, no, I don't want to be part of their world. I don't want to be part of this culture of cruelty. And so I felt quite hopeless because I couldn't crawl. There's no way I could get out of there. There was no direction. And I went into a place, an absolute pit of despair. And down in that place of complete hopelessness, my mind called forth a very vivid memory of me being a child sitting in a Sunday school classroom singing Jesus Loves Me. And when I recalled that, I felt what I had felt as a child, that there was this Superman, supernatural being named Jesus who had protected me as a child from the monsters in the room. And when I had nightmares at night, I'd call out to Jesus, and the nightmares would go away and the imagined creatures would go away. And so I called out to him in the hopes that what I believed as a little child was true. And I didn't know whether it was true or not. I mean, it was an act of desperation. And I called, Jesus, please save me. And with that, a tiny light appeared in the darkness like a star, and then it got very bright, very rapidly. And it was a little bit terrifying because it got so bright and so large very quickly. And it overcame me, and in that light, I saw myself for the first time, which was very horrifying, looking at what was left of me. And out of the light emerged hands and arms, and he reached down and touched me. And when he touched me, two things happened. The least important one is that all the gore kind of began to disappear, and I was restored physically. The most important thing was when he touched me, I was filled with his love, which is so great that it's impossible to express, because all of the experiences of love that I've had in my life don't begin to describe the overwhelming sense of love that I received from him. And his hands slid behind my back, and he picked me up and held me very tight against him with his arms around me. And I wept for joy with my face against his chest.
So, how do we even begin to analyze the story at this point? Because again, I'm trying to be I'm not really a skeptic, but I think for the point of view of this interview, it's necessary to try to see what a skeptic would say at this point. I'm not sure what a skeptic would say, except perhaps to say, again, to go back to this idea of perhaps there's something buried deep within his subconscious which comes out at the moment of death and the time of trauma. The sort of thing that you yourself would have said before this experience.
Right.
But
right.
Clearly this is not how you interpreted it at all.
No, because one of the things that it's impossible for a person to appreciate who hasn't had this kind of experience is this is much more real than what we call reality. What I was experiencing is much more vivid in every sense than what I experience in my day-to-day life.
And of course, this is what all the experiences say. And this is, I think, for people who are researching the whole era of consciousness, this is, it's very interesting, because clearly there have been people in history who proposed a different model of the way that we perceive reality from this idea that, all there is the brain and consciousness is the brain. I mean, if you're talking France, and Henri Bergson famously described the brain like a kind of reducing valve. In other words, what we experience in terms of our daily reality is only a fraction of what's out there. It's because we have this particular perceptual apparatus.
Right.
But clearly you're talking, and this is absolutely common to the experiences, that they all say, hang on, that how can you say that what we were saying was a hallucination when it's actually more real than what you came back to?
Yeah. And since this all happened more than 30 years ago, I've had opportunities to, and these have been rare, but they're precious to me, opportunities to get back into that greater reality on occasion, and it's confirmed its importance and its significance in my life.
How did you get back into that state?
Prayerfully.
Right. So in other words, we're talking about a mystical experience here.
Yes.
Basically, in the great tradition of, but what's so confusing, of course, I think, to people who are coming up from that perspective, is that they associate those kind of experiences, you know, with very holy people who spend their lifetime meditating, or sort of bedridden nuns, or very pure children, etc. And you weren't any of these things, as far as I could work out.
No, but I have found that there are countless people, probably millions all over the world, that have mystical experiences, who may seem to be not only ordinary people, but some of them may be extraordinarily unholy people.
Mm-hmm. So why aren't we hearing about these things?
We can hear about them if one starts looking for them. They're all over the internet. They've written books about their experiences, and most importantly, you can meet them if you go to meetings where they gather and talk about their experiences.
So I presume you're talking about things like this famous organization IANDS.
Right.
Right. Which I mean, we're sort of jumping a little bit here, but on the other hand, and we'll come back to obviously your experience during our conversation, but I would like to talk a little bit about IANDS, because clearly that this is where the question of the scientific aspect of this comes in, because IANDS seems to be a mixture of people who've had experiences and the people who are coming from an academic perspective, trying to research this in terms of saying, you know, from a rational perspective, what can we get?
I have another recommendation, which is NDER.
Okay.
NDER, Near-Death Experience Research. A doctor in Texas is just collecting near-death experiences without any kind of commentary on them, and he's collected thousands of them, and people can go there and just read more near-death experiences than they would ever want to.
Sure.
Read.
Sure, but within IANDS, though, I think that what interests me also is the relationship between the people who've had the experience and the researchers, because I can anticipate that relationship can be perhaps a bit difficult.
Yeah, I think research is great. I love science. I'm fascinated with science, but I think some researchers bring their own biases and prejudices and their own hopes of justifying what they believe into their research, and some of which I would strongly disagree with, some of which I do agree.
And how much contact have you had with the academics after your experience?
Enough to know that I don't need any more.
Well, that's a whole subject in itself. I did notice that recently the Templeton Foundation sponsored a big university project about the question of liminal and near-death experience. And one of the amazing things, but a book was published by Oxford University Press with the conclusion of the research. But it turns out that the research didn't include any interviews with actual experiences.
Yeah.
And I think, wow, I mean, that in itself is a phenomenon that says, I think that raises deep questions about the nature of knowledge and what we consider valid sources of knowledge in terms of epistemology. You know, what is it? How much can we base our approach to reality on testimony? I think that really is, and that's obviously a core question for any religion as well. Because I mean, testimony is fundamental to, and in the Christian faith, it's obviously fundamental to the belief in the resurrection, for example.
I think my response to that is C.S. Lewis came up with the idea of maps are very useful. And, you know, humanity has been for thousands of years working on the idea of producing reliable maps. And as a consequence, in this day and age, we have access either through printed maps or through GPS. We have a guide to like anything, practically anywhere. And they typically are pretty reliable. I'm an old-fashioned guy, so I like printed maps more than I like GPSs. But you know, if we want to, we can look at the map, which is the history of the testimony of people who have searched for the lay of the land, the route, the geology, and we can also find guidebooks that can tell us what we can, you know, further nuance the map. Or we can go out and ignore the maps and just wander around and see what we discover.
Right.
I personally, I like the map idea. I'm following the you know, 10,000 year history of map making in my journey.
Right, sure, but that's also fascinating because again we've still skipped over a huge part of your story here. But it turns out that after you came eventually out of hospital, you were still trying to process this in terms of how does your experience relate to the world's religious traditions, plural, because you investigated a number of them, I think.
Right. Well, let me go back to the experience,
yeah,
because I think that will explain
sure.
why
Okay.
I concluded what I concluded. So this person who I called out to Jesus and who I knew was Jesus, and to this day, and completely convinced it was Jesus, he took me out of that place of darkness, and we were traveling through space at a very rapid speed. And I was trying to get my composure because I was still weeping of joy. And I looked up and we were headed towards a huge, vast, what I described as like a galaxy of light. And I realized that it was where God was, the God that I said didn't exist. And I felt terrible. And I thought to myself, he should put me back where he found me. He's made a terrible mistake. I don't belong here, meaning moving towards this place of God, this place of light and love. And with that, we stopped our progress outside of the world of light. And he spoke to me for the first time. And I heard his voice clearly in my mind, but I think he was just putting his voice into my mind. And he said, we don't make mistakes, you do belong here. And I thought, how did he know what I was thinking? And he kind of chuckled and said, I know everything you've ever thought. And I thought, ooh, that makes me pretty uncomfortable, because there's lots of things that I've thought that I don't want you to know that I've thought. And when I thought that, I immediately started to think about the biology of women, to keep it nice, particularly breasts. And he laughed heartily. And I couldn't believe, I mean, I thought, I can believe you think that's funny. And he said, oh, lots of things you do are funny. And we began to converse, because he completely put me at ease. And I knew that since he knew everything I'd ever thought,
there's no point hiding anything.
I mean, what am I afraid of? I mean, so we were conversing, and he said, well, I really would like you to meet some people. So he called out in musical tones, and a group of angels, what I refer to as angels, which were my guardian angels of my life. They came and hovered in a semicircle around us, and they proceeded to show me my life from the when I was born to the present. And it was a very painful experience. Started off fun and got less fun as I saw what a selfish, successful, manipulative person I had become. And I was very relieved when it was all over. And he asked me if I had any questions. I said, I've got millions of questions. He said, ask anything you like. So I asked him everything that I could think of to ask him at that time. And everything I asked, he answered carefully, clearly. We went places. He showed me things, lots of things, past, present, and future.
And it wasn't just personal things as well. I mean, it was sort of big questions like, why the Holocaust and stuff like that,
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I mean, when people ask me how long did that take, I tell them, well, longer than I was in graduate school, which was 3 years.
Well, I mean, this is already extremely strange again, because what was the time on the clock when you came back to consciousness?
Half an hour.
Okay. And it's true that, I mean, if anyone who's read this book will realize that, and there's enormous detail of this.
Yeah, and in the book is only a tiny fraction of what I experienced.
Huh. Will you ever write any more of it?
I struggle with that because I've gotten in so much trouble for going beyond the bounds of the tradition that if I write more, I'm only going to get myself in deeper with certain factions of society. So I don't know what to, my good friend St. Paul wrote about his near-death experience and said that there's a lot of things I can't talk about, and I'm sort of taking his advice. Sometimes it's better to just not talk about stuff.
Yeah, I can sort of understand that, because I mean, there is a lot of pushback that experiencers get. Yes.
Yeah. So, anyways, after I had exhausted all of my questions and had been re-educated, I said, I want to go to heaven. And he said, no, you're not fit. So he and I had a big argument. It was a very strong argument. And he was very kind and rational and explained to me with every objection I had about me coming back to this world and not going on to heaven. He had good reasons why it was better for me to come back and get another opportunity to do this life in a different way than I had been doing it. And so finally I agreed with him. And when I did agree with him, without any transition at all, I was back in the body, back in the bed, back in the pain, and immediately, it was now 9 o'clock at night, and the nurse came in the room and said, doctor has arrived at the hospital and you're going to have this surgery. And my wife was evicted from the room and they prepped me for the surgery, which I had at 10 o'clock.
And it was still very messy, no?
Yeah, because of the migration of the digestive fluids, I had extreme peritonitis. So I left that hospital after a week and came to the United States, and I was in the hospital for a few months back in the United States and had more surgery and stuff.
Right, but I mean, when you say you went back to the States, there's one element of your story, I think, which again is disturbing because it has a wider implication, and it's very counterintuitive in the sense you asked all these kind of questions, but you're also given a sort of warning, in a sense, it's as if you feel that you came back with a kind of message about the future of the United States. It's back in the 1980s, yes?
Right, 85.
And you're not the only person to have, several people around that time had more or less the same kind of experience as you did. It was very strange. But now at 30 years distance, what were you told, and what did you think you were told? Okay, we have to use this kind of, let's try and be as objective as possible. And how has it shaped out?
Well, what Jesus told me was that God is unhappy with the way the world is going, because God would like this world to be what we would call a paradise, where people would live in harmony with each other and with nature, and that people would. Some of the details is that the main occupation of everybody would be in the raising of children. that would be the number one priority of everybody in the world is the care of children, and that everybody would be free to pursue their own interests. So some people would become musicians, and some people would be scientists, and some people would be, homemakers, and some people would be crafts, different kinds of crafts, etc. Whatever people would do, but the world that we have is full of competition and domination and exploitation, and God was very, very dissatisfied with that. And what Jesus told me was 2,000 years ago, the blueprint was laid out on what kind of world this should be, the way people should behave, and we have been ignoring that, and God was very, very unhappy with it, and it was time for a major change, and the change could be, if we cooperated, it could be we could go peacefully and rapidly into a whole different kind of world of peace and love and goodness, or if we chose not to, God would, that Jesus didn't say this, but I'm using a common expression, God would set the reset button, bring this world crashing down, and a small remnant would be left to build the new world.
Right. I mean, that's. I mean, listening to something like that is if anybody is listening to this who's familiar with, say, the Catholic mystics, the 20th century, etc., it rings pretty familiar, and it's disturbing as well, because from what you're saying about your previous experience, you hadn't. This, I'm trying to test the idea that this is all coming out of your subconscious somehow. It doesn't seem. I don't see anywhere in your subconscious that this corresponds to. Why should you be thinking these things if it's coming from within you? And why does this tally with the experience of other people who were basically saying the same thing at the same time? And obviously, it's up to listeners are going to draw their own conclusions from this discussion, but clearly, I mean, I think this is one of the reasons why your story has drawn so much attention over the years, and has acquired a certain notoriety in the literature, is that certain things also that you're talking about, particularly to do with the United States, seem to have played out, and not in a positive sense either.
Yeah, I was very into science fiction, and one of the things that I found strange when Jesus was telling me about the future is that the science fiction model of the world, this high-tech world,
yeah,
it's not what God had in mind at all. That the future world of peace and harmony and living with nature appeared to be very low-tech. Very, very low tech, and the things that people were doing were kind of beyond science fiction into things that seem quite impossible, like, for example, telepathic communication between all people over the whole world, telepathic communication with other beings in other worlds, telekinesis, the ability to raise vegetables by praying over them and just the vegetables just growing right in front of your eyes, and things like that. There was global control of the weather. People would bring rain or chase storms away if they came. I mean, people actually ran the weather of the world. So there was an equitable distribution of the climate everywhere. Just amazing stuff, and of course, complete harmony with all of nature. So all of nature was thriving.
And presumably you hadn't got much knowledge. And if you'd been to Sunday school as a kid, but you didn't have any knowledge of theology, or you hadn't done sort of deep study of Isaiah or things like this, or
like a little child. That my biblical knowledge, my theological knowledge was a little child.
It was Jesus loves me. I mean, not that there's anything wrong with that, but that's where it kind of stopped.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So okay. Right. So now let's sort of fast forward a bit to say that you're getting gradually better. You're still you're in a hospital for a long time, and like many experiences, you seem to have retained one toe in this other realm, because you have certain perceptual abilities which most of us don't seem to have, that were there particularly in those first few months after coming back.
Yeah, it was too strong, and I actually I could see things that nobody else could see,
Right.
and it was very troublesome because when I wanted to talk about those sorts of things, people told me to stop it, that it was crazy, that I
Yeah.
needed to go to a psychiatrist, you know, it's like bad. So eventually I realized that I couldn't talk to people about this stuff, and I finally prayed to God to take that ability to see those things away from me.
And it stopped.
Yeah, and now I only do that when I absolutely have to.
That's very interesting, because again, it suggests that it's something almost, because it's something which is quite common in the literature. I remember reading it that the NDE of a guy who drowned and came back from the absolute point of death, but came back with these abilities which some people would say, you know, psi abilities or whatever. That he could tell what other people were thinking, that he could see certain things, and it drove him nuts. And he turned to alcohol to actually get rid of it. And after that, he had a second NDE because he tried to commit suicide, which again is so counterintuitive that you have to ask yourself a few questions about, you know, why is it that, and if you try to look at this from a physiological model, it seems to be that something happens if somebody's consciousness has left their body and then reintegrated into it. That it doesn't. It's as if there's a kind of lesion there which allows certain things in. If we're looking at consciousness like a kind of filter, and it takes a certain amount of time for that to sort of be healed in a way. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it's you know, I don't think once you've had a near-death experience, you can ever fully adjust to this world, because the contrast between what you know could be or should be and what is happening instead
It's too violent.
It's just and you want to say to people, stop. It's not necessary. You know, you need to change the way you're interacting with people and the way you're reacting to things. Just stop. Take a deep breath. Think about God. You know, like, of course, people don't want to hear that. I've been doing ministry for 30 years, and one of the things I've found is it's pretty hard to change human behavior.
Sure.
A lot harder than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, because from what I gather at the start, you basically felt that by sort of pounding Bible verses at people, they would change.
Yeah, it was a huge disaster. I made a lot of people, including my family, and they never forgave me.
No, that's really sad, and that's very sad. But it strikes me also that a lot of your what you've written is all about the difficulty of communicating this experience. And again, I mean, that's something that people who have had any kind of mystical experience down through the centuries have always encountered, because you don't have a language to deal with it.
No, and it's very frustrating, because I want to tell people about my experience, but I wish I were more articulate. I wish I were more intelligent, so that I could put it in a way that people would really get it. But no matter how hard I try, or no matter how I try and make it clear and reasonable, there just seems to be, I mean, some people are very receptive, and other people just can't accept any of it.
Sure. I mean, I'd like to talk just a little bit about the reception of this story, because it seems that within the people who are interested in near-death experiences, that they fall into perhaps two big categories. Obviously, there are people who are traditionally religious, who see it as a confirmation of what they've always believed about life after death. And then there are a lot of people who are more in the kind of spiritually but not religious, perhaps New Age category, who are more interested in, they will use language of, higher form of consciousness and these kind of things. And just looking at the sort of pushback that you have faced sometimes, and not only you, but people who talk about these kind of things over the years, it seems that a lot of it is coming from religious people, in fact.
Well, I've gotten resistance from both religious people and from what we call New Age people. Jesus told me to love everybody, and I am trying to do that to the best of my ability. But it doesn't mean when you try to love everybody, you don't end up in conflict. And I found conflict that certain Christians, their doctrines or bias don't allow for new revelations or any kind of stretching of what they can imagine to be possible. And with New Age people, I find some of them to have a real hostility towards anything that sounds at all like Christian religion. It's interesting because if I sound like a Buddhist or a Hindu or a Shinto or something like that, or a shaman, they're quite receptive. But when I go to Christianity, I've met some real hostility.
I think that's culturally quite significant, because and that really needs a lot of unpacking, because it does tally with the stories that I'm hearing from a lot of people, that there is among the people, there's a paradoxical situation, is that in at a time when theology is still, I think, perhaps a little less hostile to the nature of that notion of the supernatural than in the 1960s. I think that certainly academic theology is still at that place very much.
Yes.
So they don't want to hear about near-death experiences at all, because they just can't deal with it. But on the other hand, that the notion of the idea that Jesus of Nazareth was a real human being, and that people can still encounter him today as a real human being, is, I think, very threatening to a lot of people, or frightening for some reason. I don't know.
I found that to be my experience, and the only explanation is, since Jesus was the kindest, most loving, wisest being that ever walked on this earth, and I do believe he was both fully human and fully divine, since he was such a compassionate person and did no harm to anyone, and suggested that we follow that way of doing no harm to anyone, to love everybody, where does the hostility come from? And I can't help but conclude that people have a spirit opposed to his spirit, and that when one is confronted with the Spirit of Christ, their opposing spirit immediately goes into attack on him. It's really interesting to see how people attack Jesus. And one of the very popular ways that he's attacked is by saying he never existed, or he never was anything other than a misguided lunatic.
Yes, I mean, just in France, we've had this last couple of years. There's a very popular philosopher called Michel Onfray, who went on the record as believing that Jesus didn't exist, and that he was invented by Constantine and his mother. In fact, that they were the ones who invented his biography. And there was big controversy, and there were some theologians who went out to bat and said, "Hang on, this is ridiculous what he's coming out with."
Yep.
But it does seem that, and I think that this is a point which, whether somebody is religious or not, this is a real issue to do with critical reason. Is that we're entering a time when the debate about not only things like near-death experience, but about a whole range of subjects has become very difficult, because we don't seem to have any kind of possibility of refereeing between people who just mouth off about the subjects in completely contradictory ways. That it seems to me that a lot of dialogues within our society have broken down because we don't know how to mediate between opposing opinions, and to say, hang on, let's be reasonable about some things, because there don't seem to be any kind of norms of rationality anymore.
Right.
And does that make some sense in terms of what you experience?
Because of course there's a number of ways to research and investigate Jesus besides the primary literature of the Bible. There's secondary literature. You know, he's referred to by
Josephus, etc.
people that lived in the 1st century and the 2nd century, hundreds of years before Constantine was born. You know, I mean, there's archaeological evidence of early shrines and churches in the Holy Land. I've been to some of them that precede Constantine's mother. You know, those are very real things that people can investigate if they want to. But the most important way that they can investigate is they can, if they really wanted to, and if they were sincere, they could ask Jesus to reveal himself to them. And if they did it in a spirit of repentance and humility and sincerity, he would reveal himself to them. And he has done this for millions of people over 2,000 years, which actually brings the number up to billions of people. And the fact that a person, I mean, you know, a fair-minded person, if they wanted to find out if it was real or not, they can find out. Free, no cost, no obligation. Just do it.
So in a sense, you're saying that that faith is testable.
Yes, he's very testable.
So in a sense, that must be, because I assume that during the 30 plus years since you've had your experience, in which which has created a fair amount of trouble for you, I think, from what I'm reading, you must have had times when you think, have I lost my mind?
Well, I would always hold that possibility that I'm as mad as a hatter, and but that could be an explanation for my behavior, and I think as a rational person I have to hold that as, is that true? Except that I'm a highly functioning human being. I ran, after my experience, I ran an art department at a university for a number of years, and then I went to seminary and did very well academically in seminary and made almost all A's, and graduated, and I've been pastoring churches successfully ever since. No one's ever accused me of being weird or wacko or strange or anything. I mean, as a human being, I'm a builder, I'm a craftsman, I'm an artist. I just yesterday finished laying an oak floor in our upstairs guest bedroom, which was 4 days of really hard work.
Yeah.
Laying an oak floor. I mean, I do stuff and function very well in our society. I pay my bills and pay my taxes, and keep the show on the road, so to speak.
So in other words, that even the experience is still something which I think is very hard to communicate in language, just because of the nature of language itself. That you were still able to function and to integrate within human society, even having this sort of one toe still in this world that you glimpsed.
Yes, and I have to remind myself not to drift off at times. Because I really want to go into the supernatural world more than time and demands on me a lot.
Mm-hmm. But you were sent back in.
After my experience, I went to a monastery in Kentucky with the intention of becoming a monk, so I could spend my time in contemplation and prayer.
Right.
And they
wouldn't have you.
And I said yes. And he said, "Do you have children?" I said yes. He said, "Go home, take care of your wife and your children."
Well, it's pretty solid advice. I think it was Thomas Merton's monastery, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Famous, not just any old place, Gethsemane in Kentucky. Well, just before wrapping this up, it's been fascinating talking. in terms of where near-death experience research is now, because I know obviously you've been one of the most prominent speakers in that whole field. If somebody's coming with an open mind to the phenomenon, it's just, not necessarily from a religious perspective, but it has started to read about the fact that so many millions of people have had these experiences, what would you suggest that they read? How would you suggest they approach it?
Well, I know of a really excellent book by John Burke, Burke, and it's called Imagine Heaven. I consider John to be a friend of mine. He's a pastor in Austin, Texas, of a mega church that he started, and I think it gives you a really good overview of near-death experiences from a Christian perspective. Excuse me, I think Ken Ring is an excellent researcher. He's a PhD psychologist, and Heading Towards Omega is a really good book.
And he's Jewish?
Yeah.
Right, okay.
So, those are called, I would recommend my book. I said it to death.
Well, a huge thank you for talking to us. This has been one of the more unusual interviews on scienceetreligion.com, but I think all the more interesting for that. If you want to find more about Howard Storm, go to his website. We hope to do more interviews with experiences, because it seems to me that...
I have one important thing to say.
Yes, go ahead.
Vive la France! I love France.
Well, that's going to be music to the ears of many of our listeners.
Yeah. I was there a couple of years ago, and I hope to come back again soon. My wife and I love France.
But if you get hospitalized, just don't go in on a Saturday. I think that's what you said.
Right.
Well, thank you so much, Reverend Howard Storm, for this conversation, and we hope that we'll be in touch again. Thank you very much.
Au revoir.